My name is Harold Trinkunas, Deputy Director at the Center for International Security and Cooperation here at Stanford. I'm very pleased to be here for what looks like is going to be a terrific panel with a great group of presenters addressing what I think are some of the toughest questions about long-term planning, long-term thinking, investments in prevention and resilience, things that it often strikes me societies are all too often not very good at doing, but I hope we'll hear some hopeful examples here, as well as some careful consideration of where we stand on this important area. So to present today, I have with me Andrei Pont, who's a research director at CRIES in Argentina. He will be followed by Alberto Díaz-Cayeros, the director of the Center for Latin American Studies and a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute here at Stanford, followed by Lothar Rast, director of GIZ projects at MEXID, a German agency for international cooperation, and Madeline Rose, global policy lead at Mercy Corps. So we'll go in the order that they're listed on the panel. They'll have about 7 minutes each, and then I'll probably go directly to the audience for Q&A since we just have an hour for 4 presentations. So Andrei, why don't you take it away?
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and be able to talk to all of you, and having been able to view all the excellent presentations that we've had throughout the day. Now, the format that I have for my presentation, I don't want it to sound like we're publicizing the work that we do in CRIES, but I do take a lot from the examples of the work that we're doing just in order to better support the arguments that we're making in regards to the focus that we have on strengthening civil society capabilities in the region. And it's also very Latin America focused, so I'm sorry if that's not an area of specialty to many, but that is where we work mainly. And something that's very interesting when we're talking about Latin America is that there's two very well-marked characteristics to the region. One of it is that it's a relatively stable region when it comes to interstate conflicts. So not only is it a region that does not commonly engage in wars between states, but also many of the regional and sub-regional organizations have declared it a zone of peace. And also, it is a region with widespread violence at many times abnormal levels for the rest of the world, which makes it a bit of a contradiction, but it also helps us identify what are some of the tendencies in regards to violence in Latin America. In regards to this perceived zone of peace, I think a lot that contributes to this perception in the region has to do with there's a strong tendency on behalf of the regions in the country and many of its regional organizations to understand the importance of de-escalating and bringing about conflict resolution at a regional level and trying to avoid the interference of extra-regional actors. And sometimes there's good examples regarding hemispheric levels of dispute and conflict resolutions. But also in recent years, the work that was done by regional organizations such as UNASUR, or including, but I'll mainly focus on UNASUR, also SELAC, shows that there is a generalized will on behalf of the countries in the region that when there is a conflictivity situation, that it's regional actors that take the lead in trying to bring about resolution. The first case that I wanted to discuss regarding the work that we've done in CRIES and that helped us better understand what we can do from a civil society perspective is that it was back in 2008 that we started what was called the Cuba-United States Academic Workshop. And back then it seemed like a very far-fetched idea that academics and former diplomats could have any impact on the lack of US and Cuban relations at the time. But we managed to continue for 5 years with the development of a series of workshops in which we gathered these Cuban academics and former diplomats, and we looked for ways in creating a common agenda between the two countries that how someday could become an element, a tool, or some type of document that could eventually have some positive contribution to the reestablishment of relations between the two countries. And of course, I will not say that we are responsible for the normalization of US-Cuban relations, because that would be very far-fetched. But I will say that, if we look at how the normalization went when it was declared on the 14th of December in 2014, when both President Obama and Castro in Cuba announced the ongoing dialogue process that had been going between the two countries, it was part of a multidimensional, multi-actorial initiative in which all these different government actors, regional actors, civil society actors were involved, and each one was able to put in a small grain that contributed into the solution. And in our case, what we managed to do is that we had a final document that was published in 2012, and that document, what it did is it set up a already discussed possible agenda for the bilateral relationship. And we helped a lot of the people inside both foreign affairs services to skip a lot of the steps regarding the discussions that they would need to have. Learning from this experience is that we decided to expand our efforts. And a few years back, almost simultaneously actually, Stanley Foundation and the Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation were very kind in inviting CRIES to observe the Latin American Focal Point Network, in which they were creating this network of government officials working on issues regarding mass atrocity prevention and genocide prevention. And it was that process of observation of how this regional government network was developing that led to the idea that this could be complemented, or at least it should be accompanied in some way by a civil society network. And we started putting together a civil society network. We wanted to break away from the traditional human rights networks or conflict prevention networks that had existed and we had been participating in for a long time too. And we wanted to reinforce it by some of the experiences regarding regarding the understanding of the multidimensional approach. So the network that we started setting up had civil society activists from the human rights area and from conflict prevention, and we had people coming in from foreign policy think tanks and public policy think tanks in different parts of the region, academics. And the first challenge that we ran into was Venezuela. And of course, how could an initiative that was based on working on conflict prevention, that had a strong focus on mass atrocity prevention, ignore the ongoing situation in Venezuela, a situation in which there's consensus around the existence of systematic human rights abuses on behalf of government forces. There's political persecution. But even more than that, there's also a growing humanitarian crisis that's overspilling its borders. Some of the numbers, just to have an idea, is we're having 40,000 Venezuelans cross over the border to Colombia every week. Colombia is the main recipient, and those numbers are also a bit fragile because considering that around 2 to 3 million Colombians were living in Venezuela before the crisis, and those are also returning to Colombia, those are not being considered into the numbers of people that are also pouring back into Colombia. The crisis is hitting hard also in the border with Brazil. It's hitting a lot of the Caribbean, smaller states in the Caribbean, which much less installed capacity to receive all these people. So we figured that our impact was not going to be at reestablishing dialogue between the parts in Venezuela. There's a lot of people trying to get involved with that, and I'm sorry. But that we could have an impact at a regional level. We could have an impact in trying to mainstream the information coming out of those border areas. We could have an impact on trying to inform on policy in the countries that were receiving those refugees, that were dealing with this humanitarian crisis. And that's what we're hoping to advance now, right now. It's a small step, it's a very specific subject, and there's in the back, you can find some of the policy memos that we've been elaborating on that for a series of workshops. And we hope that these small contributions can help at an ongoing crisis that if there's no regional actions on it, then it's likely gonna get a lot worse.
Thank you. Turning now to Alberto Díaz-Cayeros.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm a little bit in trouble because academics, we sometimes make a 7-minute question, not a 7-minute presentation. So I've been cutting a bunch of things from what I was going to share with you, but I hope I can keep. No, I will keep within the allotted time. So I'm going to start actually with a conversation that we had, Steve Kilelai and I, the last time he was here at Stanford, which was a discussion about the optimal number of policemen. He probably doesn't remember, but we were discussing, okay, so what is the optimal number of policemen? Should you have a lot of policemen, less policemen? There seems to be clearly a problem when you don't have enough policemen. And policemen, we don't think of it as something that has to do with prevention. We seem to think, policemen are there once all the bad things happen. But obviously, they do have something to do with prevention. But I want to start there because I think I have an answer now to our conversation back then. And back then, what we were, just discussing this, but I think what we have to understand a little bit better is how communities create their own policing mechanisms through systems of social integration and self-control, rather than the corporations of specialists in violence. When we understand that a little bit better, then we can make a little bit more sense of how to think about the optimal level of policing or what kind of policing we should have. And, let me go back a little bit, quite far back. One of my two hats, I do this work on violence prevention, questions of police trust in Mexico and Brazil and the Caribbean. But I have a very strong interest in the colonial period in Mexico. And indigenous communities in Mexico and all throughout Latin America in the colonial period, the phrase that was used of how a good sort of society looked like was to live in police, vivir en policía. And the idea of living in police was this aspiration of the governance of indigenous communities, of how they should work. And I actually, because of the conversation we had at lunchtime, I will actually read in Spanish very quickly, but this is, for example, the Recopilación de Indias, the Indies recopilation from 1680. It says, ordenamos y mandamos que las leyes y buenas costumbres que antiguamente tenían los indios para su buen gobierno y policía, y sus usos y costumbres observadas después de que son cristianos, pero que no se encuentran en nuestra religión, se guarden y se ejecuten. So things that do not exist in the Christian tradition, we want those things to be kept in the uses and customs of these indigenous communities, and it is about their good governance and their good police. The term, of course, in the colonial period had like a dark face, as all things in that period, but part of it is this was not just about colonial authorities having control over these communities, it was about how these communities were policed. This is why it was policia. These were political city-states with self-governance, with some degree of autonomy, with some independence. There was this urban character of living politically, and this implied a series of obligations as citizens to exercise some rights in political life, such as voting, going to an assembly, having public debate. And in some ways, this was all related to what we would call, the sort of the governance dimension within the positive peace discussion. So Galtung actually, when he defined the positive peace concept, he was thinking about integration of human society. That was the phrase he used. And in some ways, what we're talking about is something that I think the work we are discussing today has turned into a very complex and very important operationalization of how to think about these problems. But in some ways, I think at the critical element, and of course here I'm a political scientist talking about this, is to understand a little bit better about how these governance dimensions are constructed and how do we prevent, how do we create prevention. Now, how does prevention work? And I'm going to talk 1 minute about police prevention, and then I'm going to talk about risk-focused prevention. The police prevention, basically, what we know now is that a lot of what we need is these ideas, for example, of how to restrain the use of force of police. So that is a huge question in the United States, in Latin America, in Brazil in particular. We know that there's some solutions to this that have to do with things like proximity policing, trying to find ways to embed our specialists in violence inside the communities where they're going to be acting. Learning something about hotspot crime, how to use, the scarce resources that police forces have, and how do you move, deploy those resources that are always limited over territorial space. But finally, the biggest question is really something about police, about how do you construct citizen trust? How is it that people start feeling that they can be safe, that they can trust a policeman, a police officer? And of course, this is linked to things, even in the history of the United States, police corruption, police brutality, etc. Risk-focused prevention, which is the other huge literature and the other huge kind of research agenda on these things, is really about how do we impact, mostly at the psychological individual level, on people who might engage in risky behavior that would eventually become, they will become members of gangs or they will join some criminal organizations. And here we have these ideas of, okay, individually or family-based approaches, school-based programs, retraining, community-based interventions. There's an enormous amount of those. And of course, what seems to be the most powerful thing going on right now is cognitive behavioral interventions. I don't have time to spell out how all of those are working in different ways, but many of them are working incredibly well in Latin America today. I don't think we are working very well on the police side. We have been working quite well on some of these interventions that are usually done by NGOs on the ground, very much embedded in the communities where they do this. Let me tell you about two that we have studied with some detail in Mexico. I'm going to spend 1 minute on each of them. So one of them was called Jóvenes con Porvenir. This was an initiative of one mayor in Mexico City, in Guadalajara, in the metropolitan area of Guadalajara, Zapopan municipality. What the mayor wanted to do is, he was very concerned about this idea that has been very prevalent in Latin America, that we have a whole host of youth that are called ninis, neither work nor study. These are people who have dropped out of school, but they don't really have steady jobs. They're kind of hanging out. So what do you do about these ninis? It turns out that the whole ninis concept, after we did the evaluation of this program, they're always doing something. It's not really true that there's such a thing as these ninis. But anyway, the program was about how do you create some skills to these kids that are out there. And this was started by a municipal government, and it was taking advantage of a whole synergy with universities that would be willing to put basically university resources into training programs, 6-month training programs. They could be of anything from cooking to nursery assistant to DJ. So there was a huge range of things that you could learn during those 6 months. We did the evaluation with the expectation that what we would find is a lot of things on psychological attributes of the kids that went into this thing, that we evaluated 15,000 kids, 3 generations of this program, 5,000 each 6 months. We were thinking we would see things like the 5 attributes, psychological attributes, kind of resilience, grit. We thought maybe we would find some education outcomes, that some of these kids, after the 6 months spent in a classroom, they would want to go back to school. And we thought we might actually find some effects on job-related things, but we thought we would find nothing. It turns out we found big effects on job markets, hours worked, new jobs, connections to social networks that allow them to go into meaningful occupations, and actually very little on grit, very little on resilience, very little on the typical things. Second one, I cannot really talk about it. It's an evaluation we're doing in the Caribbean. It is called the Community Youth, Family Youth and Resilience Program. It's very similar, CFYR, very similar to a program that was done in Central America by USAID. In that one, it's about having a whole family approach, and the idea is that mostly you have to make some incidents on the mothers and on someone who's kind of the primary caregiver in some of these communities. It's not so much about the kid himself or herself who has got into trouble. It is something about going into the intervention. And finally, what I want to end up with is telling you that even though we try to do these interventions, the one thing we have found in our research is that the communities that seem to be best at doing this are actually indigenous communities in Mexico. In indigenous communities is where we have found they have been much more able to resist the onslaught of drug traffic organization. They have a very firm control over their territory, but most importantly, police jobs are actually volunteer jobs. In Oaxaca, for example, they're called topiles. These are places that actually have, talking about the optimal level of policing, they have maybe 8, 9 per 1,000. So they actually have a very high level of policing, but these are volunteer policing who do this as work that they have to do for the community as they advance in different charges and duties within their indigenous communities. I'm sorry, I went a minute and a half over. Sorry.
Alberto thought he'd be safe over at the other table from my timekeeping, but not so. Rast?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Harold. Thank you very much for the invitation. I just want to say I'm very glad to be here. I used to head the first peace-building program of the German government in 1999, and I was in the academic sphere before, so I'm really glad to be back in this field. When I read the questions, I thought, gosh, if I could answer them, I probably would apply for a professorship here at Stanford. So what can I tell you what you haven't heard yet? So what I'm trying to do is, first of all, talk about mechanisms of dialogue that we found useful. Secondly, give you an example for that dialogue on SDG 16, which I want to make a blunt commercial for, because I think it's still too unrelated to the peace-building community. Thirdly, say some words about multi-stakeholder alliances, who sound very sexy, are very difficult in practice. And fourth, if time permits me, on levels and challenges of participation. Starting with the first one, I think the Agenda 2030 still is seen by many people as a development agenda. I disagree. I think it is an agenda of transformation. It's a promise. It's a promise by governments really to make an effort of sustainability in all its aspects. Here you have the Sustainable Development Goal 16, which is what they call the governance SDG. I did make an effort, well, show it. I was thinking whether I show it or not. It's just the other one. You know, it's intellectually always challenging if you go out of your intellectual comfort zone, which I did with the Positive Peace Index, which I have to admit is the first time I sort of got engaged. But I don't want to bore you with the details, but I hope you give me the credit that there is a great deal of overlap of the indicators of SDG 16 and the Positive Peace Index. I didn't have the time to check the Global Peace Index, but I guess there are some of them as well. But what's the message? You can use the SDG 16 for many aspects that I think are relevant to Positive Peace Index. That's my argument here, which I just want to sort of highlight. It's a commitment by government. Governments in September 2015 said, I'm committed to that. You have global indicators and objectives, and you have to define national ones. So this is something that is going on right now, and I'm working for the German government. Oh, and I forgot to say I'm here speaking on behalf of myself. I'm not representing neither the government or the GIZ. Sorry, I always have to say that. But it's this commitment, and we work here with the Mexican Foreign Office on this process in Mexico. And so you have an example where you have a commitment, but you also have certain challenges here. Number one, some see it as a bureaucratic exercise. It's statistics. You just have to show how you do, and this is what the Millennium Development Goals were about. This is different. This is a promise of transformation in the name of sustainability. So I would argue in the name of sustainability, positive peace, I think this is an opportunity. It's not by chance that the General Assembly passed a resolution in 2016 on sustainable peace. It is in line with this. It's in line with this SDG. That was the short commercial on SDG 16. And we actually did an exercise together with the Mexican government to invite civil society, talking about dialogues, to say, look, here's the SDG 16, we have to do a national program on it. What's your thought about it? And the first thing I would like to mention here is language. Because imagine you have a mathematician and a mediator trying to find a language. This was a little bit the situation. We have the Statistics Institute, INEGI, and civil society organizations who want to talk about human rights. And he said we have to talk in terms of indicators. If we don't talk the language of indicators, we cannot do it we cannot use it for the Agenda 2030. And it was a difficult exercise, but I think it's a very worthwhile exercise. And something I would like to stress here, I think it was a very interesting point to find that kind of common language in the context of SDG 16. They presented their proposal, and now we are in the process of seeing how we implement that. Secondly, what I wanted to add here is we're talking a lot about multi-stakeholder alliances or multi-stakeholder approach. We did that in this process, and it was difficult, and it was actually the traitors among all of them who made the biggest progress. I have an ex-boss of mine who said limited violations of internal norms is usually the precondition for progress, and it's true. If you do not have these people who say, no, let's not always do this the way we always did it, but let's try it differently, it won't work. What did that mean? We had government officials who really started to dialogue with civil society where there was no mandate, where it wasn't necessary, where there was no decree of doing that. So in a sense, this is something that I would like to share. And the second thing I would like to share is this exercise showed us that we highly underestimate, in many cases, the role of the private sector. For example, in Mexico, it's one of the driving forces in what we discussed this morning on anti-corruption, and I would also say on many issues of transparency. And finally, I would like to mention two things on participation. I think we all agree if we have schemes of participation, we have more acceptance, we have more of resilience. That's on the positive side. But the challenges are that we faced is, one is you need a certain technical level. If you don't have that technical level, it's difficult to really have a meaningful participation. That begs the second question, voluntarism versus really do it as a profession. And we very often saw some limitations in participation because we saw either they professionalize and they really dedicate a greater portion of time in these kind of schemes, or they stay on a certain level in their participatory schemes. And finally, you very often have the discussion of a budget. When you have participatory structures, they say, well, are we just discussing or are we also deciding something? And then you have the risk of actually creating parallel structures. I really try to sort of skim through some of our projects now really in high speed, and I'm happy to explain more of these things in detail in the discussion. But again, I would like to really make an advertising that we should all use more the SDG 16 dynamic in the countries that are going on right now. Thank you very much.
A few specific questions I was asked to answer. One is, where does this framework sit in relation to other key frameworks driving U.S. investment or international investment in foreign assistance and foreign policy? I think this framework is incredible. Steve and David, I've sort of joked with people at lunch. I think we could have had the whole day of just David briefing on the index. I think it's an incredibly useful framework, and it's incredibly timely. I will say the last 18 months, outside of the high politics of our presidential transition, in Congress, this is one of the biggest priorities to members of Congress and to staff, is to get their head around how do we select and efficiently engage in a basket of countries and which buckets of issues matter the most in enduring peace. One of the most consistent questions you'll get asked on the Hill right now is, how do we prevent a Syria, which David mentioned. So it's not just that idea that it's not just an absence of violence, but it's clearly these other issues that we miss and that we don't have good analytical frameworks to drive policy investments. So this framework is really timely and I think is so politically useful. However, the other frameworks that it bumps up against, I would say, are 4 or 5. One, counterterrorism. So which is now sort of being vaguely transitioned into countering violent extremism or preventing violent extremism, which does not have a legal definition. But counterterrorism drives the most amount of foreign investment in the world today, and it kind of currently trumps any national security strategy. we do not have a national security strategy, we have a counterterrorism strategy. The second would be current levels of violence and humanitarian lists. So as much as a U.S. policymaker or a USAID staff person might want to invest in these positive peace buckets, they also have to deal with the current levels of violence and displacement trackers. So the OCHA, the WHO, the levels of violence frameworks as the current levels is a big thing that this will bump up against. Third, I would agree with my colleague, the SDG 16 and the Agenda 2030 framework is similar. So those are, and then fourth, which came up in the last one, but the atrocity and genocide prevention framework. So there has been a lot of effort over the last decade in the United States to build a prevention framework. And if you look at this list, on page 98 and 99 of this report, if you look at the actual list of countries from the lowest positive peace backwards, you're going to find different countries on the atrocity and genocide prevention list in your top 15 than you do on this positive piece. And so policymakers have to reconcile with what is our fundamental goal and how do these goals relate to each other and how do we pick levels of investment for different countries based on these many different lists. And that's an ongoing process right now. Second, the question of resilience and conflict prevention. So I think for the last 15 years, and I was involved in some of the original appropriations efforts on conflict prevention and peace building funds in the US, not original, but some of the most recent. So the conflict prevention peace building purist funds are very small. So there's a couple of funds, if the US foreign assistance, USAID has about $25 billion a year to play with. The amount of actual peace building funds that are earmarked for peace building is about 1% of that $25 billion. However, so that has always been an argument for advocacy. We can incrementally plus up those accounts, right? But with this framework, you're talking about issues across the gamut of a country's development and levels and shocks within them that could lead to violence. That's going to be a much more complicated advocacy negotiation in terms of what we want changed, in terms of just pure budgeting, because resilience to changes in political shocks is harder to just you can't put an earmark around that, so it's a little bit different. Another question, I think there's been a lot of questions around resilience, right? I think certainly in the atrocity and genocide prevention community, I would say also a little bit in the conflict prevention, peace building community, I think we're wrestling with whether we want to accept resilience as a framework for our work moving forward, right? So resilience to the shock of a flood is comfortable and useful for us and has been useful for donors because that's a natural occurrence. And people can't, if there's going to be a flood in Ethiopia over and over again, that is not humans' fault. And so, of course, building resiliencies to adapt to that shock is a smart thing to do. But accepting the fact that we accept that violence will happen and should be resilient to violence is a different philosophical choice. I think there's much more comfort in the advocacy community to continue talking about it as conflict prevention. Because do we really want a society to be resilient to a genocide? Not really. We would probably rather that the genocide didn't happen. So it's just something to think about when we talk about resilience in the conflict field. We need to, similar to what the energy and environment community did 15 years ago, we need to break down what resilience capacities do we think are useful. So Mercy Corps is testing now, resilience to violent extremist recruitment, for example, in Nigeria. That's a specific component of a violence episode that you need resilience to. That's a little bit different. Then the last question is sort of how do we communicate about and build political support for these issues, which is my whole job. But again, I would loop back to I think this framework is incredible, and I think that what we've been saying in Washington, what we really feel, and to kind of communicate back to West Coast folks, I really think this is the peace building and conflict prevention sector's moment. How do we get better at violence? How do we get better at tackling violent conflict? That is the number one question every single member of Congress will ask an operational organization right now. It's the high of mind. It's the number. We've never had the political attention to this issue from the sort of development policy space that we've had before. So I think some of the things that we need to be really focused on is consistent messaging. So I thought that. So some of the messaging that's been working very well in Washington really comes from IEP, but the talking point that violence containment costs the global economy $14 trillion a year right now, that is a very good door opener for our sector. The fact that, in the OECD builds on that finding and says that if global levels of violence were to decrease by just 10%, the global economy would gain $1.4 trillion a year. I mean, that is a very good talking point. It's working very well, sort of at least in Washington. Secondly, I think we need to be very disciplined around the notion that violence and violent conflict is not and no longer just the domain of security agencies, and we really need to push back against the militarization and the securitization of responses to peace issues, and really argue that violence and violent conflict is in the domain of development and governance practitioners, that is what causes violence, and that those are therefore where the solutions will be. And then the third thing, it would just be that, we as a community, whatever that we is, we need to be for something, right? We have been a community of academics and a community of people who are against violence and against war, but we haven't really had a mobilizing thing. And so one, thing we were asked to talk about in the US Congress right now is working on legislation that basically codifies all of this. It's called the Global Stability and Violence Reduction Act of 2017. It was supposed to be introduced this morning, but it was not. But it will be introduced shortly, and it really is a mobilizing opportunity for the peace-building sector to say that it's sort of like President Obama's Feed the Future, President Bush's PEPFAR for HIV/AIDS. It is a huge, potentially multi-billion-dollar initiative focused on reducing global levels of violence and better addressing the root causes of conflict, basically building out this framework to realign U.S. foreign assistance to better get at these issues. So,
Great, thank you very much.
My name is Dave, again, Energy Peace Partners. I wonder if any of you have thoughts on climate change and how this links into a prevention agenda. I know it doesn't feature in the PPI index, which is another conversation maybe, and it's also probably not a great door opener in Washington these days, but there's clearly an overlap, and there's clearly a link. And coming from the peace and conflict world, I know that there aren't a lot of people in the community that I'm coming from looking at climate change, or looking closely at climate change. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how you see climate change linking with the prevention agenda going forward.
Well, we've had in the past some work done specifically on conflict prevention and climate change, and a lot of that work was focused on the Caribbean. Truth is that many of the Caribbean nations that now exist, if the level of the seas rise, many would pretty much disappear. And a lot of the countries, like Cuba in particular, the government is making a huge emphasis on dealing with climate change and the impact it's having on mostly its rural populations. So it has to do with the impact on shortages of water, flooding in other areas, the impact of hurricanes. And these changes are having an impact on the dynamics internally, and mostly, as I was mentioning, in the rural areas. So it is interesting to see that the Cuban government is taking a proactive approach to the issue, and it actually is outsourcing part of this work to their own version of civil society organizations, which are working inside Cuba. And although many times they are funded also by Cuban, or at least resources coming from Ministry of Education, they also receive some funds from abroad, and they're trying to tackle these issues. And I've also seen a lot of this work happen. Specifically, I would mention, if you're interested in following up on their work, FUNPADEM in Costa Rica has been doing a lot of excellent work regarding conflict prevention and climate change. A bit of a different focus, but also they're doing great work also with rural communities.
Yeah, I think from Mercy Corps' perspective, our research and climate and environment teams have been very, don't have the most popular talking point on this, but they don't think there's evidence. They certainly want to communicate to policymakers that there is no evidence that climate change will increase conflict, and that in fact in some of the areas of the world that are most susceptible to climate change, we've found the highest levels of social cohesion and the ability to adapt without violence. So Nepal, Philippines, India, places where we've done decades of disaster response, the communities almost never resort to violence despite the fact that they are disproportionately affected by climate disasters. However, certainly climate change and displacement trends are of incredible concern, and climate driving more displacement has the potential to drive host community displaced tension potentially, but no clear evidence. Certainly, we don't want people to think that climate refugees will be particularly more violent, for example.
Maybe just two comments. I would also join in and say there are no sort of general claims or hypotheses, but we do have cases where when in particular it hits the rural area, the vulnerable groups, for example, the access to water or to land or to forests, which are usually already problems before, and very often they are exacerbated like that. But I would agree with Madeline, you have to look case by case. I mean, I wouldn't sort of dare, and the empirical evidence isn't there to say climate change means more conflicts in this or that. But particularly where you have existing problems and conflicts, very often it's exacerbated for that.
Hi, Todd Lindbergh from the Hudson Institute in Washington. I like Alberto's question about the proper level of policing, because it reminded me of the work that I was doing before I got into the atrocity prevention world, which had a lot to do with integrating Central and Eastern European countries into Euro-Atlantic institutions, including the EU and NATO. The NATO question was a very interesting question, because we had everybody needs to make some sort of military contribution to be a good member of the NATO alliance. But how many soldiers does it require to do that? Well, in the case of the Baltic states, they didn't have armies. They didn't actually have an independent military capacity, and they had to build that up. But in the cases of Bulgaria and Romania, the problem was just the opposite. The militaries were much too large. So I guess I'm making an appeal for a kind of Aristotelian approach to a lot of these questions. It may not be it may not be that more police, in some instances, more police may be bad, and in some instances, not enough police is bad. In a sound business environment, in some instances, easy entry into business is good, but sometimes there might be a cost in terms of protection, societally, regulation necessary, and so forth. So that's a general question. Now, if I could ask Mr. Rast a question, could you say something about the German government's new white paper on conflict prevention? Would that be a fair question to put to you?
Yes, that's right. It's actually fairly new. I think it's 2 weeks ago. I mean, it's the first comprehensive, let's say, government white book. And I think one always has to see it from both sides. I think the political orientation or the fields are not that new. But for the first time, it has actually been brought together from different areas. And let me share something with you. We had a panel on this white book, and I made a question which I at least felt we couldn't really collectively answer. We said, look, we always say conceptually it's so important to combine the efforts of development, of peace building, and of military and security. Do you have an example of actually talking about military presence and a peace-building efforts going hand in hand? And we didn't. We didn't. No, because, again, sharing that with you, I mean, the development ministry, we are, together with the UK, we are the only ones having a ministry of its own, which is always in attention to have one foreign relations. And we always said we have to look at our standard procedures, how we work. We do not work with deterrence. For example, we worked in Nicaragua with community policing, no problem. But when we come really to the armed forces for development agents, it's difficult. So we said, it sounds good. It's politically correct to say, of course, we have to combine our efforts, but we found it incredibly difficult in practice. Again, don't quote me. It's not official, but I'm saying it's the first effort to really from all the ministries. So it's a huge effort inside. I personally wouldn't say the focus on human rights, on protections, on mechanisms of conflict resolution are not really new. But that's my personal view. So, but I think one has to see it. It's now it's a matter of the whole government, sort of committing the whole government. And that is something that will be followed up in the President's office of Ms. Merkel in the future. So I would see it more, it's not a negative term, more in terms of bureaucratic politics within actually a goal one level higher up. And this also usually means funds. This usually also means not being in the budget of one ministry, but actually in the federal budget. But as far as I can see from the focus, it's actually it's not that new from before. And I would like to make a comment that was made at the very beginning. I think we still have, and I would not only say Germany, Europe, but maybe the US is closer to Latin America. But I still feel that the attention, the international attention, if you look at that white book, is obviously Northern Africa, it's other areas. We still have that, this phrase, Latin America is fixed, it's democratic. Yes, it's unequal, but it's fixed. And I think this kind of positive, I'm a little bit provoking, but if you look at the nuances, why they focus on other regions, you find these kind of comments. It's a democracy. Yes, Brazil, it's not all perfect, but it's a democracy. And they compare it to other regions. This is why Latin America is sometimes seen as the fixed in a sense of continent. I think just the positive peace index is really putting the finger where it should be.
Can I just say something on the question of the number of police? I think what we are starting to understand is, in some ways, at least from the scholarly point of view, is that all policemen are not equal. I mean, that there's very different types of policemen. So my plea a little bit is, the reason I finished with indigenous communities in Mexico is because those have community policing. The Brazilian experiment of the UPPs, although it has basically collapsed in many ways for other sorts of reasons, related more to budgets and to the financial crisis, etc. But the Brazilian experiment in Rio of creating this proximity police, which were the UPPs that would take over the favelas once you get these units that come with overwhelming force against drug traffickers, it was a great idea. It was the sense that these guys would play soccer with the kids and would take the pregnant woman to the hospital, So there was a sense of how to embed the police in the community. So in a way, the way I see this is we need more policemen. For example, Nicaragua has probably the most successful I think police reform in the continent, and basically was done by the Sandinista government. There's a female woman in charge with the Ortega government, and the legacy comes from a guerrilla that won a civil war. That some people would say is authoritarian. Actually, they are democratic. It's a very complicated set of things, but to me, that's actually one of the success stories.
Mark Schneider, I want to go back to the question of the police in Mexico as a larger issue. Two things. One, the degree to which the police reform or getting the right numbers without comparable reform in the judiciary and prosecution doesn't get you very far, number one. Number two, the numbers of police seems to me, frequently are less relevant than, are the police responding to a non-corrupt command structure, or are they part of a problem of corruption which is much more systemic?
I think it's very compelling what you said. I think it's a question of also the quality, the training. Mexico has invested an enormous amount, for example, on the control de confianza, which was supposed to be this vetting of police officers. It has no effect on how citizens trust the police. We've done systematic research on this, no effect whatsoever, because the police keeps on being the same. Actually, the hardened criminals who are part of the police are the ones who pass the vetting most easily. The young policeman that is afraid when he's doing the polygraph is the one that fails.
Interesting. Okay, maybe we can go in reverse order for the last comments. Maybe Madeline, if you have any last words? Or
No, I would just say I think reconciling SDG 16 and the Positive Peace Index and current levels of violence by the WHO is certainly something that policymakers and the US government is going to be thinking about for the next few years or few months, at least in terms of how do we reallocate and most effectively reallocate our resources to kind of look at these bottom 15, so the lowest positive peace in countries. That's where the vast majority of assistance goes, and that's where those are the sort of problems that the world hasn't been solving, the same kind of conflicts that the world hasn't solved for 20, 30 years. So that reconciling these different frameworks and figuring out how do you put something together that's quasi-universal or at least focuses on these kind of lowest countries and helps change policy is something of great interest. So grateful to be here.
Thank you. Lothar, do you have any last words? Or?
Yeah, no. Just to one comment. I think what we should look at is really how we can implement certain concepts, certain ideas which were mentioned today in practice. As I mentioned, dialogue. I feel dialogue is very difficult in practical terms. Multi-stakeholder dialogue and alliances, etc., etc. So I think I'm very grateful for this opportunity, and I want to thank the organizers, and I would like to suggest that if there is some space to really, and it means going to the ground and maybe collecting examples and projects, but I think there's a lot of wealth that might be undug in the practice that goes beyond the conceptual level.
I want to build a bit on what you said regarding the funding situation for Latin America. And it is true, for a lot of the big donors, especially in Europe, Latin America pretty much fell out of the agenda. I think one big example of that, specifically in the conflict prevention area, was the Dutch Foreign Affairs Ministry a couple years ago decided to completely drop Latin America off its agenda, with the exception of Haiti or any other country which had a really low developmental index. Therefore, what this has caused is that, while I do agree that sometimes there's this interpretation that Latin America is fixed, it's relatively democratic, relatively, and I emphasize relatively once again. The issue is that the lack of funding that we have seen in the past sometimes has led to the increase of difficult situations. I won't say it's the direct factor in it, but there's a lot of the larger foundations in the United States that were supporting a lot of programs in countries like Venezuela that in the early 2000s decided Venezuela was no longer a priority on their agendas. And nowadays, we're dealing with a Venezuela that's there's 2 to 3 million people just leaving Venezuela. There's 30,000 homicides last year alone, and it's become one of the most violent countries in the world. Of course, a lot of their funding ended up being directed at very important situations like Colombia and Central America and Mexico, which I'm not going to say one is more important than the other, but the fact is that many times when the funding is cut in relatively arbitrary ways, we end up on the long term seeing some of the negative effects. And I think one example right now that's very clear in that sense is that Venezuela is in a very complicated situation, and a lot of the funders are still not interested or have not recuperated the programs that would have led to funding in conflict prevention specifically, or also human rights area in Venezuela.
Well, please join me in thanking the panel and thanking the organizers for this terrific session.